One of the things I think that folks are not aware of is that this agenda of fake meat, of cell cultured meat, is right now, it's about 10 years behind their early prophecies, their early prognostications. The reason it hasn't happened is because when you try to culture cell structures in a bioreactor, you don't have the entire organism's functionality to dispose of waste, to move energy around within the structure, within the cell structure, and basically all you have to move stuff is bubbles and filters, and those are not nearly as efficient as a body, whether it's a cow or a person or a cat or a tomato for that matter. And so um, and so the truth is that when they thought they were going to be cranking out millions of pounds of this stuff, they've actually only cranked out a few pounds of it in little gallon jugs because they can't get rid. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Beyond Labels, the podcast with yours truly, Joel Salatin, a farmer in Virginia, and our favorite researcher, Dr. Sina McCullough. And today's topic is coming on the heels of the announcement just in the last week where Italy banned the use, sale, import, or export of food and feed from cell cultures or tissue derived from vertebrate animals. A lot of us call this fake meat, lab meat, cell structured meat, whatever. But the point is, it's fabricated. It's fabricated meat, and this is, of course, a very hot topic in lots of circles, from climate change discussions to dietary discussions and all sorts of things, to animal welfare, all those kinds of things. We've already done a podcast digging into this topic a little bit, but we're going to come to you today with some more updates and some additional thinking with this new development from Italy, which, as we all know in America, a lot of times the way Europe goes, America follows about 50 years later. And so if this is the kind of thing that's developing, we're seeing it. And we certainly see an increasing ostracism of meat eating. California now they haven't passed it into law, but there are bills being submitted to create segregated meat eating areas in restaurants, like they used to have rooms for smokers, and to segregate smokers away from non-smokers. And now it looks like there's more and more impetus to go to public spaces where meat eaters will be segregated from non-meat eaters. We don't want to be in this, same room. And so, we do see the rumblings of these kinds of things, developing in our own country. But this Italian law is certainly, an interesting take, where Italy has said, we don't want anything to do with it. We're not going to eat it. We're not going to grow it. We're not going to import it. We're not going to export it. So they've taken a very strong stand against it. Wouldn't you expect that from a place that creates Parmesan cheese? So anyway, here we are, and Sina's got some new information. Is going to bring us up to date a little bit on where we are in that whole, that cell cultured meat scenario.
Thanks, Joel. So yeah, like Joel said, there's a lot of updates to provide. And then I want to really dive down and discuss this with Joel from, a farmer perspective, also libertarian perspective, and what he thinks about all of these laws and banning, and should we be banning food in general? Okay, so as Joel mentioned, in November, Italy became the first country to ban what we're calling these cultivated meats, or the lab-grown meat. The Italian Minister of Agriculture said, quote, "In defense of health, of the Italian production system, of thousands of jobs, of our culture and tradition, with the law approved today, Italy is the first nation in the world to be safe from the social and economic risks of synthetic food." Right? The Italian Prime Minister Meloni said that farmers are one of the main reasons why we should ban fake food. She said, quote, "We could only celebrate with our farmers a measure that puts our farmers in the vanguard, not just on the issue of defending excellence, but also in defending consumers." Okay, in that bill, Italy also banned companies from using meat references when they're selling plant-based alternatives. So for example, if you're marketing a product as quote unquote tofu steak, that would actually violate this new law. All right. So I wanted to contrast that with what's happening in the US. While Italy was the first to ban cultivated meat, the US was one of the first countries to approve cultivated meat for human consumption. There, to my knowledge, there's only been 2 countries that have approved cultivated meat for human consumption, and that's the US and Singapore. So the time frame for how this happened was in November of 2022. The FDA announced that it completed its first pre-market consultation for a human food made from the cultured animal cells. Then in June of 2023, the USDA gave its first ever approval to produce cell cultured meat to 2 companies in the United States. Those are Good Meat and Upside Food. The approval was for lab-grown chicken. Good Meat said that the company also received early in 2023 a no questions letter from the FDA. So our audience knows what that means, right? That's a GRAS listing. So this lab-grown chicken was quote unquote approved by the FDA through the GRAS loophole. What's been approved so far in the US is the lab-grown chicken, although Good Meat says that they're working on other types of meat, including cultivated beef using cells from California pasture-raised cattle. Okay, Research and Markets, a group that predicts trends, they're actually predicting that the global lab-grown meat market is going to reach nearly $2 billion by 2035. They said that the largest market share of this segment is actually attributed to increasing adoption of the on-the-go lifestyle, as well as the growing demand for snack products and frozen foods. Okay, now I found this interesting. There are some states that are pushing back. So Missouri and Florida seem to be in the lead of trying to exercise states' rights. On November 13th of this year, 2023, a Florida state rep filed a bill, it's HR 435, and the bill aims to prohibit the, quote, manufacturing, sale, holding, or distribution of cultivated meat in the state of Florida. The commissioner of the Florida Department of Agriculture is fully on board. He said the following: without this legislation, untested, potentially unsafe, and nearly unregulated laboratory produced meat could be made available in Florida. Now, as of November 22nd, that bill has moved to the Agriculture, Conservation, and Resiliency Subcommittee. So it has not passed yet. It's in another committee. Missouri passed a law in 2018 that prohibited plant-based and lab-grown foods from being labeled as meat. Okay, so you can't misrepresent it as an actual meat product. Meanwhile, other countries seem to be pushing the agenda of switching from animal-based proteins to plant-based proteins as well. They're saying this is because of climate change. So Germany already sells synthetic meat products manufactured by Beyond Meat. They're reportedly selling in over 1,600 stores. The Netherlands and the UK, they've actually earmarked public funds for research and development of cultivated meat, as well as alternative protein sources, respectively. And Spain is actually studying the potential of cultivated meat in preventing food-related diseases, right? So they're actually trying to figure out if there's benefits from this. And something else that I found that was interesting before we jump into Joel's take on this is that the American government also seems to be pushing the narrative of more plant-based consumption. Okay, the latest U.S. dietary guidelines that came out, if you look on page 34, and of course we'll include the link to this, it says, quote, shifts are needed within the protein foods group to add variety to subgroup intakes. Selecting from the seafood group or the beans, peas, and lentils subgroup more often could help meet recommendations while still ensuring adequate protein consumption. They go on to say about replacing processed or high fat meats is advised. They want you to replace these high fat meats with beans, peas, and lentils, and they say they would have similar benefits to the health of the American population, as if you were, similar benefits to consuming these fat-based meats, which, they're talking about predominantly the red meats. So I found that fascinating because for me, this is an indication that the government is on some level starting to push into this narrative of let's consume more plant-based proteins. I mean, they are literally stating it in the new dietary guidelines. And as you know, these are used to shift policies, right? They set policies, they shift the way that manufacturers make foods, they shift what's being served to the elderly in nursing homes, people in hospitals, children in schools, in daycares. So they are setting the policy, and it's moving towards plant-based protein. And what I think is fascinating is that I want to share this story, and then I'm going to throw it over to you, Joel. So in June of this year, of 2023, there was a study from Purdue University that is actually blatantly challenging these U.S. dietary guidelines that are recommending this shift away from animal protein and toward plant-based proteins. So there's a couple things that I find fascinating that this study has revealed. Basically, they said that the dietary guidelines are recommending that you consume more plant-based protein on this ounce equivalent portion. Okay. So if you look at the dietary guidelines, they group proteins into animal-based, and this would be your red meats, poultry, fish, and eggs. And then there's plant-based. This would be soy products, beans, peas, lentils, nuts, and seeds. Okay. When they are comparing the animal-based protein to the plant-based protein, they use what's called ounce equivalents. So basically, a 1 ounce equivalent equals 1 ounce of meat, or a whole egg, a quarter cup of beans, or a half ounce of nuts. Okay, so this is what they use to differentiate between the plant and animal protein sources. And then this is the dietary guidelines that trickle down to affect all of us. Okay, so it's really important to know, how did they come up with these ounce of protein equivalents? Okay, this is what they say. Not only has no study has assessed the same ounce equivalent portions of animal versus plant proteins, right? So they haven't even assessed the difference between consuming animal protein and plant protein on an ounce equivalent portion. But they say, quote, the basis for stating that these protein foods are, quote unquote, equivalent and have, quote, similar nutritional content is unclear. So researchers can't even figure out how is it that they have classified these different foods as being equivalent to each other. And we know they're not, right? I mean, this is basic nutrition. We know that the protein quality and protein quantity differ in the different foods. Like pork contains about 7 grams of protein, whereas 1 ounce of almonds contains about 3 grams of total protein. So the total amount is different and the quality is different. And that's what I want to briefly chat about on this study. They actually measured the qualitative difference between these protein sources. And they did that through measuring the essential amino acids that were actually absorbed into the bloodstream after young and old adults consume these different foods. So essential amino acids, if you're not aware, are in the nutrition world, we say that you can't make these. That's why they're called essential amino acids. You have to eat them. And they're very important because you have to have the amino acids in order to build things like certain muscles and hormones and for your metabolism to work properly. So if you don't consume enough essential amino acids, it's correlated to poor health And you need to have enough essential amino acids in order to think about, like, in order to build muscle, to maintain muscle as you age, to maintain proper metabolism and immune function. Okay, so it's a very critical marker in the field of nutrition. And what they did in this study was they fed human subjects. They fed them either 2 ounces of pork or 2 ounces of egg or beans or almonds. And they fed them on different days, okay, in a mixed meal that was the same each time. And then they drew their blood for a total of 5 hours to track what happened with the essential amino acids that got absorbed into the body. How much was actually absorbed? And was there actually a difference in quality between these proteins? And they found a huge difference. Not surprisingly, they found the greatest amount of essential amino acid bioavailability. So basically, the greatest amount of essential amino acids that were absorbed into everybody's bloodstream came from pork. The second greatest came from egg. And then beans and almonds were the same. There was no significant difference between them, but there is a big significant difference between beans and almonds and the pork and the egg. So these researchers went on to basically conclude that, quote, these results highlight the shortcomings of using ounce equivalents to achieve the dietary guideline recommendations for protein requirement. And they're saying that this study is going to serve as an important resource for the future dietary guidelines of America, for them to reevaluate the appropriateness of equating different protein sources comprising the protein food groups on an ounce equivalent basis for young and older adults. So, like, in the science world, this is harsh language. Right? Like, you don't say things like this in a study, right? You try to be very neutral because you need your funding. So these scientists clearly feel very strongly about this, and they're pointing out something that's very critical, because number one, it's an oversimplification, right? So when we're talking about, oh, you can still meet all your dietary protein requirements based on the plant-based diet, they have completely not only oversimplified it, but it sounds like they're just making up what these protein equivalents are. And in the dietary guidelines, they don't even reference how they come up with them. And so now we have scientists coming out and saying, hey, this is actually pretty much a lie of what you're promoting to the country for them to be eating. And you may, in fact, be endangering people. So for me, it's so much contradiction that our government, on one hand, with these highly influential dietary guidelines, are pushing this plant-based narrative, and they're saying, oh, you'll be fine. Shift more of your intake to plant-based protein sources, and you'll be completely fine. Meanwhile, we have the scientists saying that's actually not true, and we don't even know where you came up with that. So I think that I think it's another one of those things where, you know, you really need to look beyond what they're saying. You need to ask the questions of what's happening here. Why are they being driven to say this? And so I'm wondering if there's actually, global influence, industrial influence, high-powered entrepreneurial influence that's touched these dietary guidelines even more than we had previously thought. Thank you for joining us on Beyond Labels. Our mission with this podcast is to make it accessible to everyone.
But we are behind a paywall because the issues we discuss are often subject to censorship. We've run into that, and so we have an extremely modest paywall to let us have the freedom to discuss the kind of issues we want to discuss in the way we want to discuss them. And you can become a member and enjoy all this content by clicking on the description box below. We look forward to having you join our family.